If you're caring for a person with dementia or long-term disability, it's easy to feel like you're totally alone. What if I told you that you were part of an army of millions of caregivers and we're all pulling for you to succeed? 11 million Americans are primary caregivers for their spouses, partners, children, or other loved ones. Most of them work long hours and don't get paid. My name's Aaron, and for 5 years, I was the primary caregiver to my wife, Diane, until Lewy body dementia claimed her life. So I know caregiving is hard, physically, emotionally, and mentally, but I can tell you it also makes you better. Today, I'll share 3 keys to success in long-term family caregiving. I've spent hundreds of hours in support groups and online chats with caregivers just like yourself. Now, I'm sharing what I've learned because those of us who have been on this journey know what it's like to feel like no one gets us, no one understands what we're going through. If you're on this journey, you've just arrived at a tiny little oasis I call the Manly Caregiver. Okay. What do I mean by successful caregiving? If you're on this journey, your loved one has a disabling condition or a degenerative illness for which there is no cure. How can we even talk about success when we know that our loved one will never be restored to full health? At the time of my wife's diagnosis, Diane and I had been married for 25 years. She was more than my great love, more than my best friend. She was my partner in life. We traveled around researching books and giving history talks. It was a life we had worked for, and we enjoyed it. So when Diane failed a simple memory test in her doctor's office, it was like a gut punch. And when she got that diagnosis of Lewy body dementia, we were devastated. But I was determined that Diane was going to get the best care that I could give her. My resolve was tested many times over the course of the next 5 years. But over time, I was able to land on what I thought was a pretty good definition of success in this type of caregiving. Here it is. A successful caregiver makes the life of their loved one as peaceful, painless, and pleasurable as they can. For us, successful caregiving is not about the future. It's about the here and now. It's about the present state of things. This can mean a moment. This can mean a season. When it's defined this way, success is something that we as caregivers can aspire to. And then later on, we can look back through our tears and realize that we did a good job. Lots of people that I've met over the years have successfully cared for their loved ones. You don't hear their stories that often because they don't make good copy for the news. Successful caregiving is not something that your doctor or neurologist will talk to you about. It's not something that will come up in a conversation with the social worker in the little office down the hall. The way I'm talking about successful caregiving is not even the way that most books talk about caring for people with dementia and disability. But if you are this kind of caregiver, then making your loved one's life peaceful, painless, and pleasurable is the whole ballgame. Everything else follows from that. So let's look at these 3 key mindsets that I have found from my own experience and talking with other successful caregivers. The first key mindset is embrace change. When Diane was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, we knew our lives were going to be upended. Now, my wife was a very practical woman, so years and years ago, we had everything worked out with the wills and the estate planning and the health directives and all that. Once we got the diagnosis, we quickly settled on a plan to downsize and move into a more accessible house. Now, that fell on me, of course, and it proved to be a very Herculean task. It involved, I think, 4 moves, but that turned out to be the easy part. When I began to focus on Diane's illness, then I had to start reading the literature on her form of dementia. I joined support groups, and so I started hearing the stories of other caregivers. People began describing to me all kinds of changes that would happen to their loved ones, physical and emotional, as well as mental. And I thought, is this what's going to happen to Diane? Turns out this is a very common reaction among caregivers. You get information anxiety from all the stuff you read online, and then you go to meet with other caregivers and you hear their horror stories. For me, it really got my caregiving journey off onto the wrong foot because I began to associate change with pain and dread and misery and grief. I heard more than one caregiver say, you just sit around waiting for the next shoe to drop. One thing I wish I had learned sooner as a caregiver was to stop dreading and fearing change, but be embracing change. Now, some change is easy to wrap your arms around, especially when you're in charge of the change. Because we were downsizing and moving, this was a project, and guys love projects. So we started to get rid of the things and sell off the things we didn't need. I found someone who would take Diane's big old piano, for instance. When it was finally time for the big move, I stuffed the car full of everything that hadn't already shipped and wedged Diane in the passenger seat, and then off we went. It was an adventure, it was change, it was fine, but I remember the first time I saw that Diane was having trouble doing something that she'd been able to do all her life. And I flashed back to all those stories that I heard in the support groups, and I realized that this was a change in my wife that I couldn't control. It was a change to her motor functions, and that would be followed by change to her emotions and changes to her personality. Because Diane wasn't a project I could manage, her changes seemed threatening to me, and I began to fear change. Looking back, I think I underestimated my own resilience and my ability to respond to changes in my loved one. It took me a long time, but eventually I was able to embrace change. Not saying I was standing at the door with confetti and champagne, greeting it as it came through the door. What I'm saying is, my wife became the living embodiment of unpredictable, uncontrollable change. And I wanted my wife to know she was always being greeted with open arms by her loving husband. And so, if I wanted my wife to feel embraced, I would need to be ready to embrace change. And once I actually got a few wins under my belt, I started to look forward to change with a sense of curiosity and loving expectation. Whatever change was around the corner, I realized I could handle it. The other thing is this: you're going to be hearing a lot of stories from caregivers about all the things that could happen, and these things will be floating in your head whenever something comes up with your loved one. I was interviewing a caregiver the other day. His wife has multiple forms of dementia, and he said this: I got on the Alzheimer's forum, and everyone was telling their experiences, and I'm like, well, if all that happens, this is going to be awful. But these are the possibilities. The chances that all of these are going to happen to you are pretty remote. Now, this caregiver also learned how to roll with the changes. And so even though today we are now both deeply grieving the loss of our wives, we do feel like we did well by them. So the first key mindset in successful caregiving is to embrace change. The second key mindset is to prioritize self-care. Long before we ever had a diagnosis, I knew that something was wrong with Diane cognitively. I knew it. Her kids knew it. So even before I called myself a caregiver or even began to think of myself as a caregiver, I started to do caregiver things. I checked our legal documents. I reached out to medical providers. I researched online. She didn't drive, so we didn't have to have the conversation about taking away the car keys. But I was already in the early stages of being a cognitive caregiver for my loved one. And this went on for over 2 years, nonstop, 24/7, until family and friends sat with me and said, Aaron, you need to hire some professional aides to come in and spend time with Diane so you can get a break. And that's when I learned one of the most important lessons about caregiving, which is that at a certain point in the care for your loved one, the priorities flip. You, the caregiver, become the most important person in the relationship, and your needs take priority over your loved one. If you aren't well, then you can't take care of your loved one. And who will? If you're always feeling stressed out, trust me, your loved one is going to pick up on it. Diane did not need me yelling at her because I was on frayed nerves, and she certainly didn't need me getting sick or even dying, a not uncommon occurrence among family caregivers, because I wasn't taking care of myself. Now, the good news is that the old saying about an ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure is absolutely true. And it's amazing how resilient caregivers can be and how much they can get out of just a little bit of rest and recreation. Anything you can do to get some sleep, clear your head, see some friends, do some exercise, which I always make my first priority when I leave the house, you will come back refreshed and ready to give your best to your loved one who deserves it. Self-care is one of those things you read about in every caregiver guide, but I can't tell you how many caregivers I've talked to who said, I feel guilty leaving them behind. Or this one, no one else can be with my loved one. Now, because of the nature of cognitive disease, it's possible that your loved one may resist having a new person in the room, whether it's a professional caregiver or a friend or a relative, a neighbor. However, a lot of caregivers have had success if they take the time and acclimate their loved one and are patient. Maybe it doesn't work that well the first couple of times. Maybe, in fact, they have to come back at it a different way. But in time, and this is partly the nature of cognitive disease, you will eventually be able to win over your loved one and get them to accept care from outsiders or a trip to someplace like an adult daycare center where they can be watched while you get a break. And by the way, I've also lost track of the number of times caregivers have said to me, I should have done this sooner. So, embracing change, prioritizing self-care. The third key mindset to being a successful caregiver is to look around and say to yourself, this is my island. Even in the best of circumstances, life as a caregiver can be an awfully lonely affair. I mean, we were lucky. Diane's entire family, her kids, grandkids, cousins, and most of her closest friends supported Diane and stayed in touch. Even then, however, days would go by when we wouldn't hear from anyone. People have jobs to go to. They have lives to live and families to raise. Your job, and you're probably not getting paid for it, is caregiver. And as much as you may dearly love this person that you're caring for, you have never been in this situation with them before. Eventually, you're going to have to keep an eye on them 24 hours a day, and it won't always be pleasant sitting around and chit-chatting. It can be stressful. We've already talked about the health implications of this, but there are social implications as well. There will be friends of yours who will simply vanish, maybe even family members. There's no denying the loneliness and isolation of family caregiving. So, I want to give you an image to think about. I want you to imagine that you and your loved one are castaways on an island. There's been this storm, and you've been violently carried away from the life that you've known, and you've been unceremoniously dumped on a desert island. For weeks, you look far and wide for the sign of passing ships. Finally, you realize that you can't spend all day hoping that the Navy would come to the rescue. What would you do if it was just you and your loved one stranded on a desert island and you had a microwave, cable TV, and YouTube? This is a fanciful analogy. I'm not asking you to go all Tom Hanks on me here. But I think, especially for new caregivers, the journey can look so dark and bleak and miserable that it's easy to forget that this is a journey. It's a journey that happens in a very small, confined space where very few people are admitted. You, your loved one, some family members, maybe a couple of aides, but mostly you and your loved one. And if it were me, I would spend my time making that little slice of paradise as pleasant and every day a vacation as I could. And that is, in fact, what I wound up doing. I had to learn to embrace change. I had to prioritize self-care. I had to learn to pull down the oxygen mask and serve myself before serving my loved one. But I was in time able to make this house, the one I'm sitting in now, into a little oasis, an island of care. And believe you me, if I did it, you can do it. Every day I send out an email, just a little something to support you on your caregiving journey. You can sign up for that and download my new caregiver's guide at TheManlyCaregiver.com. Thank you for watching. Until next time, Take care.